In the early 16th century, the German-speaking lands were riddled with conflict between the ambitions of the Holy Roman Emperor, the encroaching threat of the French, and the continual squabbles of the nobility. There emerged a unique breed of soldier, the Landsknecht. These were mercenaries, flamboyantly dressed, often drunken, and famously undisciplined, yet they formed one of the most feared and effective fighting forces in Europe. But behind the garish, puffed sleeves and giant Zweihander swords lay a more ordinary struggle. What did intimacy look like for men constantly on the move, surrounded by violence, disease, and little else but other men? The Landsknechts were infamous for their fashion. Their brightly slashed doublets, wide-brimmed hats, adorned with feathers, and colorful hose gave them an almost theatrical appearance. It was not just vanity. Appearance was survival. One's clothing often showed rank, wealth, or bravery. But beneath those layers of silk and wool were very human needs. These men were not monks. Despite the Catholic faith still holding sway in many parts of Europe, the Landsknecht companies operated in a moral gray zone. Unlike regular armies, their loyalties were financial. They were men who sold violence, and with that lifestyle came its own cultural norms around S3X and companionship. Camps followed armies like shadows. These camps were bustling ecosystems filled with cooks, blacksmiths, laundresses, wives, lovers, prostitutes, and children. The German term Trosses referred to the baggage train, the rolling community that moved alongside mercenary units. It was in the Trosses that many of the more intimate sides of life played out. Contrary to popular belief, not all women in the Trosses were sex workers. Many were wives and partners of mercenaries. Marriage among Landsknechts was tolerated, and often even encouraged if it meant reducing desertion or improving morale. But it was complicated. A mercenary's wife might have to follow him through a dozen campaigns, often carrying her possessions on her back or pushing a cart through the mud. These women cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and sometimes fought. Contemporary accounts speak of women picking up arms when the men fell. Yet survival also sometimes meant selling one's body. Sex work in the Trosses existed openly and occasionally organized. Some companies allowed licensed women, officially sanctioned, sex workers who paid fees to the company or the captain. These women were protected by the soldiers and subject to codes of conduct. Unlicensed women, however, faced beatings, expulsion, or worse. But what did licensed really mean in a society without clear governance? In many ways, the regulation of sex was as fluid as the loyalties of the mercenaries themselves. Interestingly, the Landsknechts had internal codes, the so-called Articles of War, or Kriegs. These covered everything from punishment for theft to laws about sexual conduct. For instance, rape was punishable by death, at least in theory. In practice, enforcement depended on mood, leadership, and the strategic importance of the moment. Adultery was technically frowned upon, especially if it disrupted order in the camp. Homosexuality was rarely discussed, a taboo subject in 16th century Europe. But some punishments in the Kriegsartikel hint at its occurrence. Nevertheless, intimacy between men likely happened in the same way it does in any all-male environment, punctuated by stress, trauma, and camaraderie. Public displays of affection, especially disruptive or scandalous ones, were more likely to result in punishment than private liaisons. The line between discipline and permissiveness was thin and constantly shifting. Captains knew morale mattered. A soldier with a woman and some warmth was a soldier less likely to mutiny. Of course, the cost of such intimate freedom was high. Syphilis, known at the time as the French disease, or morbus gallicus, ran rampant through the camps. Soldiers often lacked medical care, and treatments included mercury, bloodletting, and herbal poultices, all ineffective at best, deadly at worst. Some mercenaries spent their last coins on a warm bed and the illusion of comfort. Others found themselves ruined not by swords, but by disease, unwanted pregnancies, or the legal consequences of sexual misbehavior. In one account from 1527, during the infamous sack of Rome, Lansquenets reportedly rounded up sex workers and forced them to wear red sashes to identify themselves as such. Those without sashes could be beaten or worse. An example of how control over sex often blurred with cruelty and power. But perhaps even more interesting is that some of these very mercenaries fell in love with women in the trosses, marrying them and trying, absurdly, sometimes tragically, to build families while knee-deep in blood and filth. What drove them? Was it loneliness, instinct, or simply the yearning for some reminder of life amid death? In the quiet moments between battles, when the fires of the trosses flickered low and drunken songs faded into sleep, some Lansquenets wrote letters home, not to kings or generals, but to lovers. A rare preserved letter from 1531 speaks of "your lips, softer than linen, and the ache that burns me more than cannon fire." These were not monsters. They were men. Their swords were rented, but their hearts, however battered, still longed for connection. And so we return to the original question. What was sex really like for these men of war? It was a transaction. Yes, sometimes brutal, sometimes tender. It was survival. It was confusion. It was power. And sometimes it was love. But it was never simple. And it leaves us wondering, how did these strange arrangements evolve once the money ran out, or the wars dragged on for years? What became of the women in the trosses and the children who were born there? The trosses, that sprawling, stinking shadow of war, was more than just a caravan of pots, carts, and bed. It was a fragile ecosystem of human need, part marketplace, part shelter, part theater of the absurd. And at its heart, it revolved not just around soldiers, but the invisible labor of the women who followed them. In this second section, we'll go deeper into the realities of intimacy, marriage, childbearing, and survival among the Lansquenets and their companions. If Section 1 focused on sex as a chaotic blend of legality, lust, and lawlessness, Section 2 explores what happened after the bed cooled, emotional ties, survival strategies, and the unspoken burdens of life in the TROSS.LANDSKNECHTS weren't expected to remain celibate. In fact, many commanders encouraged semi-formal unions between soldiers and women in the trosses. While the church rarely sanctified these relationships, captains often recognized them for pragmatic reasons. Why? Because soldiers with wives were less likely to desert, especially if their family marched with the company, more likely to fight well, defending not just comrades but kin, easier to control, with something to lose if they misbehaved. This recognition created a kind of proto-military family unit. A Landsknecht might be issued rations for both himself and his wife. a sign of legitimacy in a world where formal documents were rare and wars moved fast. But these were not stable marriages in the modern sense. A woman married to a mercenary had to pack her life into a cart, learn to cook for a dozen under fire, and prepare to run at a moment's notice. Her role blurred. Part wife, part logistics officer, part shield, and sometimes part sacrificial pawn. The women who followed the Landsknechts fell into several broad but overlapping categories. Wives and long-term partners. These women often bore children, helped maintain camp discipline, and were viewed somewhat favorably. Some rose in informal status, especially if married to officers. Widows, a soldier's death might mean instant social and economic ruin. Widows could remain in the camp, but often only with permission, and only if they had useful skills cooking, laundering, nursing. Otherwise, they risked being turned out or forced into sex work. Sex workers licensed and unlicensed, as discussed in Section 1. Many women traded companionship for coin. Some had arrangements with individual soldiers. Others operated with broader clientele. The line between wife and sex worker was frequently blurred. Even a wife might occasionally trade favors when resources ran low. Laundresses and camp laborers, perhaps the most overlooked group. These women performed vital tasks: cleaning clothes, boiling water, removing lice, digging latrines. Yet their work was unpaid and considered base. They often bore the same risks of disease and violence as soldiers, with none of the protection. And what of the children? They were everywhere, small shadows darting between tents, playing with discarded sword hilts, learning to count using cannonballs. Some were born of love, others of desperation, coercion, or survival. Soldiers might acknowledge them or not. There was no law, only luck. Life expectancy was low. Disease swept through camps like wind through dry leaves. Childbirth was treacherous. A woman might die bearing a soldier's son in the morning and be buried in the mud by afternoon. No ceremony, no record. Still, some families endured. There are accounts, rare but telling, of Landsknechts dynasties, where sons grew up in the trosses, learned the trade of war, and eventually signed on as soldiers themselves. War, sex, and survival formed a generational cycle as persistent as it was brutal. It would be wrong to suggest these relationships were idyllic. Many were fragile arrangements shaped by pressure, proximity, and power imbalance. Jealousy ran hot in the trosses. A soldier might become possessive of a woman he couldn't afford to keep. Duels were fought over insults, gestures, even glances. Knives were quicker than justice. But there was also real emotional currency. Men who spoke tenderly to lovers, who carried locks of hair into battle, who wept when lovers were lost. Beneath the blood and bravado were ordinary frightened people trying to build a life from the scraps they were handed. In one particularly haunting case from 1540, a group of Landsknechts mutinied, not over pay or rations, but because their wives and children were denied shelter during a freezing march. They faced flogging, some execution. But their protest remains a quiet testament to the human bonds forged in the trenches of hell. When coin ran dry, sex became currency. Sometimes that meant transactional sex. Other times it meant emotional manipulation, coercion, or forced arrangements. The company's leaders were not above using sex to maintain control. A captain might allow a favored soldier access to a woman as a reward. Conversely, a woman might offer herself to an officer in exchange for protection. In these moments, power and desire fused into a currency more volatile than gold. This wasn't romance as you know it, but it was real, and it shaped decisions. Soldiers deserted to stay with women. Women betrayed husbands for safety. Some stayed in the trosses long after lovers were dead, not from loyalty, but from necessity. The camp was brutal, but outside it was worse. One often overlooked part of mercenary sexuality in this era involves folk belief. Many soldiers and camp followers adhered to local superstitions, especially surrounding sex and fertility. Some believed that sleeping with a woman before battle would bring bad luck. Others believed it would grant protection, especially if done on sacred ground or timed with the moon's cycle. Sex was tied to omens. A woman weeping before sunrise might predict slaughter. A broken comb could signal betrayal. Soldiers carried talismans, often given by lovers, into battle, kissed before death, or buried with the fallen dot. In a few rare cases, female camp followers were accused of witchcraft, especially if a campaign ended poorly. In one such event, in 1535, 3 laundresses were drowned in a river by superstitious mercenaries who blamed them for a failed siege. No trial, just rage, cold water, and silence. Intimacy among the Landsknechts was never a matter of simple desire. It was a tool, a comfort, a danger, a bargain. These relationships, complex, contradictory, and sometimes cruel, helped hold the trosses together. But they also shaped the emotional landscape of early modern warfare in subtle, underappreciated ways. A soldier might forget a battle, but he'd remember the feel of his child's hand, or the look on a lover's face when the carts rolled out again. And so we are left with a harder question. What happened when these mercenary companies disbanded? When war ended or contracts dried up? Where did the women and children go? Did love survive in peacetime, or was it just another casualty of endless conflict? As the echoes of cannon fire faded and blood-soaked banners were furled, mercenary life did not end, it dissolved. The war would move on, but not always with its soldiers. Disbanded, unpaid, and unwanted, the Landsknechts often found themselves stranded in the very lands they had once plundered, and with them came the trosses. This final section explores what happened after the campaigns, the long walk back to nowhere, the fate of women and children left behind, and the way sex, love, and companionship among mercenaries unraveled once the swords were sheathed. Unlike state armies, mercenary companies were temporary by design. When a war ended or a contract was broken, men were released from service. There were no pensions, no transport home, no guarantees. A soldier might be thousands of miles from his village, surrounded by strangers, without coin or command. Many died, not in battle, but in these in-between spaces, victims of starvation, exposure, or retribution. Cities and towns often refused entry to entire disbanded companies, fearing crime or disease. And so, the trosses, once a bustling support system, became a liability. Some captains tried to abandon it altogether when Landsknechts were discharged. Their camp followers faced an uncertain fate. Married women might try to return with their husbands to their home regions, if they had one. But border politics, old vendettas, and shifting allegiances made these returns dangerous. A wife from Saxony might not be welcome in Alsace. Unmarried women often faced expulsion. They might be turned away at city gates, rounded up by militias, or forced into local brothels as vagrants. Children born on campaign had no documents, no land, and no official parentage. They were invisible in the eyes of society. Some tried to settle near former battlefields, forming shanty towns of ex-mercenaries, widows, and orphans. Others wandered, offering their services as domestic laborers, washerwomen, or increasingly prostitutes. This was the slow-motion unraveling of wartime intimacy. Love affairs turned into liabilities. Partners became strangers again, and children were a burden none could afford. Mercenaries with surviving families often returned home as damaged goods, mentally, physically, and spiritually. Even those who came back with a wife or child faced suspicion. Why? They had lived among foreigners. They had consorted with sex workers. They were seen as corrupt, violent, unclean. In some regions, laws prohibited former mercenaries from holding land or joining guilds. A man might return to his village only to find his inheritance taken, his house occupied, or his family dead. And the woman who followed him, who endured frostbite, childbirth, and cannon fire, had no legal claim to anything. These couples sometimes stayed together out of necessity, sometimes out of loyalty, but more often because they had no one else. Historians often treat the trosses as a footnote, a logistical necessity, but in truth, it left a deeper legacy. In cities and towns across early modern Europe, records show surges of masterless women appearing after major campaigns. These were former camp followers, wives of fallen soldiers, widows of mercenaries, who were never properly buried. Many ended up in poorhouses, city brothels, rural labor camps, but some formed informal communities, known locally by names like Kriegerweiber soldiers, women, or Karenfrauen cart women. These groups offered mutual aid, child-rearing help, and sometimes even mercenary matchmaking, connecting women with new bands of soldiers as wars ignited again. It was a grim kind of resilience, built not on pride but survival. A woman who'd seen the siege of Metz or the sack of Rome knew how to cook in mud, barter under threat, and find the safest soldier to trust in a room full of blades. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Landsgext world lies in its children. Some became camp rats, surviving by begging, stealing, or being adopted into other companies. A few were trained as drummers or errand boys. Others, particularly girls, were swept into cycles of exploitation. Lacking birth records or protection, they could be married off at 13 or 14 or sold into servitude. Their mothers rarely had the legal standing to resist. A few children rose ironically by embracing the very world that birthed them. They became mercenaries too. There are records of multi-generational service in the same units, with names like Hahn, Kraut, and Stickel appearing across campaign rolls. But most faded. Their stories exist only in silent footnotes, described in baptismal ledgers, tax rolls, or criminal charges as illegitimate, unhoused, or beggar child of unknown origin. In later centuries, the Landsknechts would be romanticized, painted in woodcuts and plays as lusty, wild, free men. Their women were cast as dangerous sirens or comic drunks. But the reality was quieter, sadder, and infinitely more human. They built love in mud. They raised children in tents. They grieved in silence. They survived without being remembered. The bonds formed in those moving cities of war were fragile and powerful. Some couples genuinely loved each other. Others tolerated or used each other. But all existed within a system designed to discard them once their utility ended. And even when a soldier found peace, perhaps on a farmstead or behind a tavern bar, he rarely spoke of the women who'd followed him. The Trosses did not make it into memoirs. Their names were not carved in stone, but their hands built the fire pits. Their arms held the wounded. Their bodies bore the next generation. So what was sex really like for Lansquenets? It was never just about pleasure. It was about relief, risk, power, and sometimes hope. It was a transaction, a betrayal, a lullaby, a negotiation, a memory end. When the drums stopped and the banners were lowered, those stories died in silence. Not because they were unimportant, but because they belonged to people history chose to forget. So the next time you hear of a great siege or a famous battle, ask yourself, who was boiling the water that day? Who held the soldier's hand that night? And what happened when the war ended and no one came for them? In the layered hierarchy of feudal Japan, honor was everything. To live as a samurai was to live by the blade and the Bushido code, loyalty, discipline, self-sacrifice. But what happened when that structure shattered? When a lord fell in battle, or was disgraced, or simply died without an heir? Then a samurai became ronin, a man adrift, a warrior with no lord, a sword with no sheath. This section explores the intimate, often silent, world of the ronin, masterless warriors of early modern Japan, and how sex, affection, and human connection operated within the margins of shame, survival, and social exile. By the 17th century, during the Tokugawa shogunate, Japan had become a land of peace after centuries of civil war. The swords that once thundered across battlefields now gathered dust in family shrines. Samurai, once a necessity, became bureaucrats, guards, or relics. For those without a master, there were few options. A samurai could commit seppuku, ritual suicide, preserving his honor, seek a new master, though positions were scarce, descend into poverty, becoming a mercenary, gambler, or criminal. The ronin existed in this social limbo, not peasants, but not respected. Their status made intimacy difficult. Who would marry a man with no land, no name, no future? And yet they did not live without touch. The shadows of Japan's rigid class system created quiet corners where love, desire, and survival intertwined. Among samurai, S3X was often governed less by emotion than by structure. Marriages were arranged for status, inheritance, and political ties. Romance, as modern audiences understand it, was rare. Among men, male-male relationships were documented, sometimes openly. These relationships, known as nenshoku, especially between older warriors and younger retainers or apprentices, were viewed with a complex mix of acceptance and ritual formality. For ronin, these established norms began to break down. With no clan to uphold, no family to manage, and no social standing to protect, ronin became both freer and more desperate in their choices. Love, or at least desire, had to follow different rules. Most ronin lived in urban fringes, near riverbanks, red light districts, temple alleys, or along trade roads. There, they encountered a different Japan: merchants, thieves, geishas, monks, drifters, and women without protection. Some ronin married prostitutes, not out of romance, but mutual benefit. The woman gained a protector in a world where protection was currency. The ronin gained stability, coins sometimes from her earnings, and shelter. Other ronin became lovers of widows, okamisan, female innkeepers, or even fellow outcasts. These relationships often blurred traditional class lines, quietly defying samurai taboos. But none of this was celebrated. These were silent contracts, whispered agreements forged in loneliness and necessity. Unlike prostitutes, geisha were entertainers trained in art, poetry, and conversation. Their relationships with ronin were complex. Some geisha pitied the ronin. They were men broken by loyalty, which appealed to romantic ideals. Others saw them as dangerous, unpredictable, angry, sometimes violent. A few became long-term companions. To ronin, offering a kind of emotional intimacy rare in their profession. In plays and poems of the period, ronin and geisha are sometimes paired, the disgraced man and the woman who sells dreams. Together, they formed a mirror of fallen beauty, navigating a world that had no place for either of them. But these stories often ended in death, separation, or poverty, reflecting the cold reality that society had no room for unsanctioned affection in the floating world of the Yoshiwara, Tokyo's regulated pleasure district. Sex and intimacy were for sale, but also ritualized, restricted, and observed. Ronin could not afford the most prized courtesans, but might frequent lower-ranked women, forming connections over time. Sometimes these relationships grew into attachment. A ronin might sell his sword or take on humiliating jobs to buy a courtesan's freedom. These transactions were documented in court cases and popular fiction, always bittersweet, often ending in ruin. Because even if love blossomed, it could not erase debt, restore honor, or feed a child. For many, ronin intimacy posed a moral problem. Raised to follow the Bushido code, they were taught to reject base desire, to prize discipline and stoicism. The pleasures of the flesh were distractions, even betrayals of purpose. But without war, what was the purpose? Some ronin wrote of their struggles in poetry, laments filled with images of lonely cups of sake, fading perfumes, the echo of wooden sandals in the night. Others drowned their conflict in violence or detachment. It's no surprise that some of Japan's most notorious killers and outlaws during this time were disgraced ronin. Without a master, without love, they were dangerous not just to others, but to themselves. By the mid-1600s, the Tokugawa peace was solidifying. Castles were closed, sword-wearing was restricted, and ronin were often barred from entering towns. Even marriage became harder. The Tokugawa regime issued edicts against misalliances, discouraging unions between samurai and lower classes. In this new Japan, love became a luxury for the masterless. A ronin might find comfort in a tea house, lover a street singer, or a child calling him father in a shack outside Osaka. But these lives left no records, no scrolls, no monuments, only worn-out sandals, and a few fading poems. So what was sex and love like for the ronin? It was transactional, sometimes violent, often shameful. But it was also deeply human, a flicker of warmth in a society that had turned its back, which leaves us asking, were the Ronin victims of their own code, or of a society that no longer needed the men it trained to kill? And what kind of love can exist when the world insists you have no name, no future, and no worth? In the soft hush of a Kyoto night, a man in a worn kimono, his once pristine blade now wrapped in cloth, shares a silent meal with a woman who once danced for lords. Neither speaks of the past, neither dares speak of the future. This was love for the Ronin. In this section, we explore the hidden domestic lives, emotional entanglements, and fragile unions formed by masterless samurai. These were not grand romances sung by biwa players, but quiet acts of resistance in a world that erased anyone who no longer fit. By the early 1700s, Japan had become an island of order. With Tokugawa control firmly in place, the chaotic warfare of previous centuries had faded into memory. For the Ronin, this was not peace, it was irrelevance. Many Ronin found work as temple guards, living in monk-like austerity, bodyguards for merchants or shogunate officials, school teachers, instructing in calligraphy or swordmanship, or, most commonly, as day laborers, carrying goods or digging ditches. In these lowly roles, they often met women who, like them, had been displaced by the new Japan servants, dismissed from noble homes, daughters of bankrupt farmers, prostitutes, nearing the end of their marketable youth. Together, they formed households of survival, built behind paper walls and under leaky roofs. Marriage certificates were rare. Property was shared by agreement, not law. These unions were socially invisible, but emotionally real. Women who partnered with Ronin took on great risk. Their man might disappear for weeks, wandering in search of work or meaning. He might be violent, brooding, or haunted by a past he would not discuss, but he might also be the only man who listened, because he knew how it felt to be disregarded, protected, because he had been trained to love in the only way he knew how, with fierce, silent loyalty. Some records show these women petitioning local officials to spare their Ronin husbands from arrest. In one 1722 case from Nagoya, a former geisha stood outside the magistrate's house in winter for 2 nights, begging mercy for her partner, who had been caught stealing rice for their child. Her plea was denied, but her act was recorded. And in that footnote, we glimpse the unwritten loyalty that defined these relationships. When a Ronin fathered a child, the challenges multiplied. Without a registered clan, the child could not inherit land or status. Many were classified as commoners, at best vagrants, at worst. Some Ronin attempted to forge samurai documents to give their children a future. Others sent sons to temples, hoping they would become monks or scholars. Daughters were sometimes sold quietly, heartbreakingly, into indenture to pay debts. Yet not all endings were tragic. Some Ronin became respected in their neighborhoods, not for their sword, but for their kindness, consistency, or skill at teaching children. In towns where the bureaucracy turned a blind eye, these families were tolerated, even welcomed. Still, they always lived on the edge, belonging to no class, no registry, no story. The emotional intimacy in these relationships often emerged, not in grand gestures, but in repetition, sharing rice from a chipped bowl every morning, repairing each other's clothes, listening for the other's footsteps after curfew, sitting side by side during temple festivals, saying nothing. There are rare surviving poems written by ronin to their lovers. They are not heroic. They speak of your breath, like steam on tea, enough to warm my fingers. Or, no lord, no war, no gold, but you bring water to the gate, and I breathe again. These are not declarations of passion. They are acknowledgments of endurance. Why did women remain with men who could offer so little? Some did not. Some left to marry farmers, return to relatives, or vanish into the crowded streets of Edo. But others stayed. And the reasons were many. Shared trauma in a world that discarded them both. Safety in numbers, even if neither had power. A kind of mutual devotion, born not of fantasy, but of familiarity, in a society where everyone knew their place. These partnerships were acts of quiet rebellion. They created homes not sanctioned by registry or shrine, but held together by rituals of care. A bowl of soup, a cleaned blade, a hand on the back at dawn. The looming shadow behind every ronin relationship was death, not from violence, but from ritual obligation. Some ronin, racked by guilt or dishonor, chose to end their lives, but often they delayed the act because of the bonds they'd formed. A child, a partner, even a neighbor who shared miso. In one haunting tale from 1745, a ronin living outside Kyoto left a note. She carried water through the fire season. She mended the cloth I tore. That is more honor than my blade ever knew. And he did not kill himself. He went on to become a gardener. Such stories rarely survive. But when they do, they hint at the emotional quietude that existed beneath the warrior's surface. Without a master, a title, or a war, the ronin's last battlefield was the heart. Intimacy for the ronin was a negotiation of memory, trying to live beyond loss, a gesture of hope, carving a life from what was left, a refusal to vanish, even if history refused to remember them. So what do we make of these men and the women who stayed with them? They were not heroes, nor entirely tragic figures. They were people who loved in the margins, quietly, imperfectly, insistently. And so we must ask, when all is stripped away, honor, title, legacy, is it possible that what remains is not shame, but something resembling freedom? Could these forgotten lovers, in their paper-walled homes, have known a kind of intimacy deeper than what duty ever allowed? In the final section of this story, we close the chapter on the ronin, not with a clash of steel or a blaze of glory, but with a whisper. Here we explore how these quiet partnerships between masterless men and marginalized women faded into the folds of history. We examine their emotional aftermath, their cultural erasure, and the rare legacies that managed to survive. This is not a tale of endings, but of echoes, those subtle impressions left behind when two people share a life, however briefly, in a world determined to forget them. As the decades passed, many ronin aged into obsolescence. The sword that once defined them was now a relic, worn at the hip, more out of habit than hope. Their partners aged too often faster, their bodies worn by childbirth, labor, or illness. In these later years, intimacy shifted again, no longer fueled by desperation or survival, but by a kind of wordless companionship. A few ronin became temple caretakers. Others were absorbed into merchant households as retainers or servants. In such cases, Their relationships, if informal, were quietly tolerated. A servant with a wife or lover was easier to keep and less likely to steal, but more often these couples drifted into invisibility. No clan, no records, no heirs, only two bulls side by side in a borrowed home. And then, inevitably, one would go first when a Ronin died. His lover might cremate him quietly in a rural shrine, bury him outside town with no marker, sit beside his body until local officials came to remove it. There are tales, unverified but persistent, of women following their lovers in death by hanging or drowning. These accounts, often recounted in folklore or regional ghost stories, reflect a cultural imagination shaped by loss and longing. In rare cases, the partner survived and lived on in near poverty, eventually entering a nunnery or dying alone. Most left no trace, no family to claim them, no records to enshrine them. But some stories did survive, passed down not in scrolls or edicts, but in plays, songs, and whispered memories. Edo period theater, particularly kabuki and bunraku, puppet plays occasionally depicted ronin and their lovers. These dramas were not official histories, but reflections of collective memory, stylized and moralized for popular consumption. The ronin was often a tragic figure, torn between love and obligation, a dangerous man redeemed by a woman's loyalty, a fool who lost everything but gained one true companion. These plays appealed to common people who saw in the ronins struggle their own experience of navigating a world that demanded order but delivered chaos. The lovers in these stories rarely survived, but their bond was treated as sacred. Even so, these were myths of loss, not celebrations of life. The Tokugawa regime, obsessed with order and hierarchy, had no interest in preserving the stories of fallen samurai who loved outside the lines. Historical records remain focused on the grand houses, the loyal retainers, the samurai who upheld the status quo, the ronin who took in a widow, or raised a child on a canal bank, or slept beside a former courtesan in a bakali hut. These men were excluded from the archive. Their partners were doubly erased. As women outside registered marriage or noble lineage, they had no surnames worth recording. They were paperless people in a papered world, and yet traces exist in old tax rolls, in temple donations made in memory of a quiet man, in forgotten graves with two names carved crudely into weathered stone. For these ronin, sex was never just about desire. It was a way to anchor themselves to something real, a protest against a society that told them they had no worth, a source of quiet strength, especially when nothing else remained. And for the women who loved them, these relationships were a chance to choose in a world where choice was rare, to choose the dishonored over the powerful, to choose companionship over coin, to choose, even briefly, to be seen. We often think history belongs to victors, to generals, shoguns, clans with crests and castles. But it also belongs to those who loved in silence. The ronin and their lovers left few written legacies, but their experiences shaped local customs, especially in port towns and temple districts. Folklore, with dozens of ghost stories about wandering blades and faithful women. Art, especially woodblock prints and rural poetry that hinted at hidden bonds. Perhaps the deepest legacy is emotional, the recognition that love, even when unrecognized, is still real and still powerful. So what was intimacy for the ronin? was not celebrated, not rewarded, not even forgiven, but it was human. It was a hand on the back during a storm. It was a shared futon in a leaky shack. It was a bowl of rice set aside each morning, even when there was barely enough for one. And perhaps it is in these smallest gestures, in this resistance to vanishing, that we find the most profound truths. So we are left with one last question. If the world forgets your name, your rank, and your deeds, but remembers that someone once loved you, however quietly, however briefly, is that not a kind of immortality? In the long shadow of the Ottoman Empire's rise, among the marble courtyards and mosques that defined its grandeur, there moved a distinct and formidable force, the Janissaries, known as one of the first standing armies in Europe and the backbone of Ottoman power. These elite infantrymen were not born into their ranks. They were taken. This section opens the story of the Janissaries, not through the lens of battle or conquest, but through the personal and intimate realm of identity, desire, and discipline, exploring what it meant to be raised by the state, forbidden from marriage, and yet undeniably human. The Janissary system began in the 14th century under Sultan Murad I and continued for centuries. It was fueled by a system known as the devshirm, the blood tax, or child levy. Every few years, Ottoman officials would sweep through Christian villages in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, taking boys aged 8 to 18. These boys, often the strongest, brightest, or most beautiful, were separated from their families and brought to Istanbul. They were forcibly converted to Islam, trained in Ottoman language and customs, and raised to serve the Sultan directly. This practice was justified by the state as a means of upward mobility, and in some cases it was. A poor shepherd's son might rise to become a general or vizier, but first he had to become a janissary, and in doing so relinquish any personal claim to self, family, or love. Janissaries were forbidden to marry. The state owned their loyalty, body, and time. They lived in communal barracks, wore identical uniforms, and moved as a single organism. Their sexuality, like everything else, was regulated. Theoretically, Janissaries were to remain celibate. They could not take a wife, raise children, build a home, but in practice, this rule was often ignored or bent, twisted, and negotiated over time. As the centuries passed and the Janissary corps grew bloated with privilege and corruption, many secretly took lovers, wives, and even established households outside the official records. Still, in its earliest and most disciplined form, the corps was celibate, not to encourage holiness, but to prevent distraction and divided loyalty. But desire is not so easily crushed. So, what did sex look like for men trained from boyhood to serve, obey, and kill? Living in all-male barracks, Janissaries developed strong bonds, brotherhoods, formed through shared suffering and ritual. Some of these relationships remained platonic, others did not. Historical whispers and Ottoman court records suggest that male-male intimacy was not uncommon within the corps. The line between mentorship, camaraderie, and romantic or sexual relationships was blurred, especially among young recruits. This mirrored a broader reality in elite Ottoman society, where male love and desire were subjects of poetry, debate, and philosophy. Some Janissaries likely engaged in secret relationships, protected by rank or camaraderie, but others faced punishment. ranging from flogging to execution, depending on who found out and when. The paradox is stark. A system that controlled every part of a man's life left him no sanctioned outlet for affection, yet placed him in emotionally intense environments where bonds were inevitable. Within the barracks, a hierarchy ruled. Senior officers, known as Akas, wielded immense power over the younger recruits. Their responsibilities included training, disciplinary oversight, moral enforcement, but the imbalance of power also created space for exploitation. There are accounts, not widely publicized, but preserved in bureaucratic reprimands, of sexual coercion or arrangements between older janissaries and younger cadets. These relationships were complex, part mentorship, part protection, part taboo. In some cases, they may have evolved into genuine affection. In others, they were pure power transactions. No official records speak of love, but poetry from the time, especially from Persian and Ottoman sources, is filled with references to the sweetness of the boy who bears arms, the longing in the tent where no women sleep, the silence between two blades drawn not in war but in want. Though the janissaries were meant to be cloistered from civil life, they inevitably came into contact with the streets of Istanbul, its coffeehouses, bathhouses, hammams, and pleasure quarters. In these urban spaces, they sometimes sought companionship, discreet liaisons with male sex workers, courtesans in disguise, Christian widows who lived on the margins, or even fellow soldiers in the hammam. Especially, men of all classes mingled, and janissaries were known to visit in pairs. Some bathhouse records, rare but suggestive, describe complaints of undue familiarity or violations of modesty tied to military patrons. Still, the empire often turned a blind eye. Janissaries were too valuable and too feared to be policed strictly. And so, in the steam of the bathhouse, in the corners of the coffeehouse, desire was indulged quietly and at great risk. What's most striking is how nameless these relationships remain. Unlike in the Christian West, where scandalous letters or trial records survive, the Ottoman archives often preserve only the administrative outline, a disciplinary matter involving two soldiers in the 15th barracks, one Acker reprimanded for keeping a youth longer than permitted. But personal voices are absent. We do not know how they felt. We do not hear the whispered apologies, the shared laughter, or the fears of betrayal. Instead, we must infer from silence, from poems never attributed, from inscriptions scratched into barracks walls, from the way certain men were buried side by side without official reason. As the centuries wore on, the Janissary corps grew corrupt. They meddled in politics, revolted against the Sultan, and carved out many kingdoms within Istanbul. By the 18th century, many had taken wives, lovers, and families openly despite regulations, but desire still operated within the confines of power. A lower-ranking janissary could lose his life for a forbidden affair. A commander might maintain a discreet lover with impunity. And for those taken as children, stripped of their language and family, the search for intimacy was as much about identity as it was about passion. When a man has no past and no home, where does he place his heart? So what was sex, love, and companionship like for the janissaries? It was controlled, forbidden, and yet inescapable. It existed between discipline and secrecy, between the uniform and the bedroll, between a boy taken from his village and the man he became in the empire's service. Which leaves us asking, can true intimacy survive in a system built on erasure of identity, of family, of desire? Or does it persist only in fragments etched into stone barracks or whispered in forgotten poetry? The Ottoman Empire's Janissaries were not merely soldiers, they were institutions, shaped by ritual, obedience, and an ideology that reached deep into their skin. They were weapons, not individuals. And yet, as we return to their private world, we find something tender flickering between regimentation and silence. In this section, we trace the unofficial relationships, domestic arrangements, and emotional contracts forged by Janissaries in the shadows of empire. We move beyond the barracks, into the corners of Istanbul and the lives these men attempted, or dared, to build outside of uniform. In the earliest centuries of the Janissary Corps, marriage was forbidden. This wasn't a moral decision, it was a political one. The Sultan's greatest fear was that Janissaries, if allowed to form dynasties or family allegiances, might shift their loyalty away from the state. But by the 17th century, that iron grip began to soften. Janissaries began to live in private dwellings, away from their barracks. They purchased homes, sometimes under the names of relatives or trusted partners, and, despite the law, many took common-law wives, women who lived with them, cooked for them, shared their bed, and bore their children, even if never legally recognized. These relationships existed in a strange gray space, visible but unofficial. The empire tolerated them when convenient, condemned them when politically useful. Yet among neighbors and shopkeepers, such arrangements were often treated as ordinary. After all, the Janissary was not just a soldier, he was a presence, a local figure, a man of flesh and habits. So who were these women? Rarely noble, often former concubines from elite households, widows of previous soldiers, converted Christians from the Balkans, or freeborn Muslim women with little social protection. In one Istanbul neighborhood record from 1728, a baker notes that a Janissary officer of the 17th barracks resides with a woman of Albanian origin, known to attend Friday prayers. She is unnamed, but her presence, domestic, religious, tolerated, is significant. These women were not passive. They managed homes, negotiated prices, raised children, and handled the diplomacy of living beside a man both respected and feared. In doing so, they carved out their own kind of authority, even without legal recognition. Some even petitioned courts on behalf of their Janissary partners, defending property or warding off creditors. Their voices remain only in these marginal notes. The woman of the house speaks for her protector, who is on campaign in Rumelia. Despite the original ban on Janissary reproduction, records from the 18th century show a steady rise in Janissary households with children. These offspring, while unofficial, were often sent to religious schools, madrasas, taught trades, cobbling, tailoring, even swordSmithing. In some cases, they joined the corps themselves in later generations as the rules relaxed further. But these children also bore the stigma of illegitimacy, especially if their mothers lacked Muslim heritage or formal marital status. Some were registered under fictitious names. Others carried their father's rank as a kind of unofficial surname. One poignant case from Edirne, 1751, tells of a boy named Mehmet, son of a janissary, who was denied entry into a guild because his family line was unclear. And yet he went on to become a Quranic reciter, remembered for his voice, not his parentage. These children represent the quiet shift from institution to humanity. The janissaries, once designed to be sterile, had begun to seed a private world, despite, or perhaps because of their rigid training. Many janissaries developed intense emotional dependencies on their lovers. This could manifest in jealousy-fueled violence, lavish gifts, silk, coins, perfume sent from campaign to home, or secret wills, naming their partners or children as heirs to forbidden property. While Ottoman law technically allowed inheritance only through formal Islamic marriage, urban judges, qadis, occasionally turned a blind eye or accepted community testimony in support of such claims. Some janissaries wrote poetry to their lovers, signed only with initials. I sharpen blades, but your words cut deeper. I wear armor, yet am defenseless in your doorway. These small fragments, preserved in personal prayer books or letters smuggled from campaigns, suggest an emotional world far deeper than the state ever imagined. Janissaries also found companionship elsewhere, in coffee houses, where musicians and dancers served more than just tea hammams, where flirtation and indulgence often slipped into intimacy, and Sufi lodges, where spiritual brotherhood sometimes blurred with physical closeness. Notably, Sufi poetry, deeply sensual and often ambiguous, was popular among janissaries. Its metaphors of divine union, longing, and submission provided language for love in a culture where overt expressions were censored or punished. Did these men speak of love in terms of the divine to cloak their feelings for each other? Or did their longings truly merge body, soul, and sword in ways we cannot now parse? Despite these glimpses of intimacy, janissaries lived with the constant threat of exposure. A lover's betrayal, a landlord's gossip, a commander's suspicion, all could lead to demotion, punishment, or death. Some men disappeared. Others were quietly relieved of duty. A few, especially those involved in scandal with boys or non-Muslim women, were struck from the records altogether, erased like chalk under rain dot, and yet these stories were remembered in song, jokes, and street tales. The janissary who built a house for his Greek lover, the one who wept when his partner married a merchant. They are in the whispers of Istanbul, in the official histories. Lay men who held lovers in secret, raised children they could not name, prayed not for victory, but for one more night under the same roof. So what do we learn when we trace the forbidden and fragile loves of janissaries? That institutions, no matter how rigid, cannot fully contain the longing to be known, to be touched, to be seen. And we are left wondering when love defies law. The state, the sword, or the heart that waits at home for footsteps that may never return. No longer the elite force of the Sultan, they had grown entrenched, corrupt, and the personal costs of that collapse, not in battles or barracks. We ask what remains when a system designed to suppress desire, identity, and emotion is destroyed, and whether the human bonds formed within it can survive its ashes. In 1826, Sultan Mahmud II weary of the Janissaries' resistance to reform, and their stranglehold on power, orchestrated what is now known as the auspicious incident Vokai Heirai. In a bold and brutal move, he declared a new army, trained in European fashion, provoked the Janissaries into revolt, surrounded their barracks with loyal troops and cannons, slaughtered thousands in a single night. The Janissary Corps was officially abolished. Their records were burned. Survivors were hunted. But the erasure of centuries of lives lived in secrecy, including the domestic and emotional arrangements that had existed in the shadows of their discipline. When the barracks fell, so too did the private worlds built quietly behind closed doors. Women who had lived with Janissaries for decades, often unrecognized by law, found themselves evicted, without claim to their homes or pensions. Children, born of unofficial unions, were suddenly illegitimate, their fathers' names blackened or erased entirely. Lovers, others petitioned local authorities, producing scraps of evidence, letters. Court record from Bursa in 1827 includes a plea from a woman named Fatma, whose partner of 14 years, a former Janissary sergeant, had been killed during the purge. He provided me shelter. I washed his garments. I bore him 2 sons. Where shall I go now? The response: no recognition, no compensation. For the sons and daughters of Janissaries, the future became a blur. Many changed their names. Some were absorbed into guilds as apprentices, or found work as boatmen, bakers. In Ottoman census records from the 1830s of unregistered children of the disbanded corps, listed under strange euphemisms of unknown father, tradesman class, youth taken in by mosque caretaker, son of former uniformed servant, loyalty and quiet love, and whose deaths left nothing behind but questions. Among the most heartbreaking erasures were the partners left behind. Some were male lovers, hidden even in life, who now had no name to speak aloud. Relationships, now stranded between 2 faiths and belonging to neither, but beds and lives, and now bore the grief of betrayal and silence. There are no monuments for them, no poetry, no prayers, only scattered references in confiscated property logs, silks found in the home of a disbanded officer. These are not love stories in the traditional sense, but they are, without question, love stories. With the fall of the Janissaries, their sexuality and their independence, and yet had created a hidden world within the empire, one where identity and affection existed outside the Sultan's gaze. And in that world, human resilience quietly defied imperial design. What remains? Not statues, not names, but fragments. A verse scratched on the back of a service certificate, a grave in a village, marked with both a crescent and a cross, a family line that whispers of a great-grandfather in uniform who never spoke of the war. Historians study institutions, but memory clings to intimacy. And perhaps the Janissaries, stripped of love by law, to hold each other amid chaos. So what was intimacy for the Janissaries? It was banned, buried, and burned from the record. In gifts wrapped in cloth, in borrowed beds, in prayers said together by people who weren't allowed to say us. And so we're left with a haunting question. If an entire way of life is erased, like footsteps in the courtyard, long after the gates are shut, in the shimmering city-states of 15th and 16th century Italy, mercenary captains who sold their swords to the highest bidder, They were warlords and politicians, tyrants and tacticians. But what did intimacy look like for men who rented their loyalty, whose lives were steeped in intrigue, movement, and fleeting power? And what of the women who orbited their world, women famed not only for beauty, but for intelligence, wit, and control over the most intimate aspects of public life? This story begins in the salons and bedrooms of Venice. But across silk pillows and political bedsheets, the condottieri were not simple men-at-arms, often born of noble or semi-noble families. They trained in military arts and rhetoric. Many were scholars as well as killers, men who could debate philosophy in the morning and lead cavalry in the afternoon. Their contracts conduct, plunder, and personal discipline. Yet, for all their calculated professionalism, these were deeply unstable careers. A single battle could destroy a man's fortune or double it. All the Italian city-states, Venice was the most theatrical. Its economy was buoyed by trade, banking, espionage, courtesanship. Unlike the clandestine prostitution of many European cities, Venetian courtesans were registered, protected, within limits, taxed, and often educated beyond most men. They spoke multiple languages. They quoted Ovid. They wrote letters on behalf of ambassadors, sometimes as clients, sometimes as lovers, and sometimes as weapons themselves, deployed by one courtesan against another in personal rivalries. To understand intimacy for the condottieri, we must first understand the power of the Venetian courtesan. There were two kinds: cortegiana onesta, the honest courtesan, a woman of refinement, letters, and exclusivity. She might have only one or two wealthy patrons at a time. Cortegiana di lume, the common courtesan, more akin to street-based sex work. The onesta courtesan was closer to a political actor than a sex worker. She was a confidant, a spy, a muse, and sometimes the only person a condottiero could speak freely with. He could not trust his paymaster. He could not trust his men. But in a perfumed room above the Grand Canal, he might whisper his fears to a woman in pearls who knew 10 times more than he did. The line between genuine affection and strategic alliance was always blurred. A condottiero might take a courtesan as a long-term companion, bringing her from Venice to Florence or Milan. Fund her lifestyle, protecting her from rivals, entrust her with letters, secrets, and even military intelligence, and she might use him to eliminate enemies, trade his letters for favors with the signoria, manipulate his fears, subtly nudging him toward war or withdrawal. But there were also real attachments. Letters survive, coded, partial, between mercenary captains and their lovers. One, written by a condottiero in 1503, reads, "The sword is cold tonight. I miss the way you sip wine, as if every drop owed you an explanation. Was it affection, seduction, performance?" In Venice, those three things were often the same. Unlike other European contexts, these liaisons were semi-public. Courtesans appeared in masked balls, processions, even state functions. Some wore distinctive clothing, signaling their status. Their relationships with condottieri were the subject of gossip sheets, poems, and even political cartoons. But visibility brought danger. If a condottiero fell from grace, lost a war, failed a contract, insulted the Doge, his courtesan might be evicted from her residence, summoned by the Council of 10 for questioning, or even imprisoned. accused of sedition or espionage. Love, in this world, was a risk, both emotional and legal. For all their pomp and public swagger, many condottieri were deeply lonely. They moved constantly, lived under threat, and were rarely trusted. Some turned to courtesans for comfort, others to alcohol, gambling, or violence. Some, especially those raised in military orders, struggled with intimacy altogether. There are accounts of condottieri who lived only with their men, traveling with young male companions who acted as squires, bodyguards, and perhaps more. The Renaissance world understood these relationships, though it rarely documented them openly. In one Florentine chronicle, a condottiero is described as never seen with women, but always in the company of his pupil, who dressed in crimson and sang at night. We do not know what lay behind those crimson curtains, but we can guess was how quickly desire could become war. A courtesan slighted by one commander might reveal secrets to his enemy. A condottiero who fell too deeply in love might refuse a campaign, choosing his lover over his employer. A rival faction might spread rumors about a courtesan's influence, using her as a pretext to challenge a military contract. There are multiple documented cases where the Council of Ten, Venice's elite ruling body, investigated sexual relationships between condottieri and courtesans as matters of national security, because in Venice the bed was not just a sanctuary, it was a battleground. So what was sex like for the condottieri? It was entangled with ambition, fear, vanity, and hunger. It was a transaction that could turn into obsession, a performance that might reveal real vulnerability. And yet, like everything else in the life of a mercenary captain, it was contingent, shaped by coin, power, and the ever-shifting tides of war. And we're left to ask, were these men truly ever loved? Or were they simply too useful, too dangerous, to ever be known without a mask? And for the women who whispered to them in the candlelight, did affection ever survive the march of contracts and cannons? By the mid-16th century, the golden age of the condottieri was beginning to tarnish. Italy's city-states were no longer independent powers, but pawns in the growing struggles between France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. The once proud mercenary captains, who had commanded armies and negotiated with popes, were increasingly seen as liabilities, unreliable, outdated, dangerous. But even as their military relevance declined, their personal entanglements, especially with Venetian courtesans, remained powerful and consequential. This section explores how those relationships deepened, twisted, and fractured under pressure. Love became loyalty, then leverage, bodies were currency, secrets were poison. The bedroom was no longer just a place of pleasure. It was a place of political espionage, personal collapse, and occasionally quiet redemption. As condottieri aged or lost favor, many turned from the battlefield to the salon. They became private advisors to noble families, military instructors for young aristocrats, or silent financiers behind certain courtesans, using their dwindling wealth to maintain relevance through influence. This arrangement wasn't always romantic. It was often transactional. She gained protection, funding, and elevated status. He gained access to gossip, entry into elite circles, and sometimes a sense of belonging. Some of these relationships lasted decades. One of the most famous involved Tullia Tarragona, a well-known courtesan and philosopher who entertained former mercenary commanders in her Florentine villa. Letters between her and one such condottiero, now lost, but referenced in later memoirs, speak of debates on love, power, and virtue, conducted in equal parts French, Latin, and sensual metaphor. This was not just sex, it was politics, philosophy, control, comfort, a negotiation of relevance between two people the world wanted to discard. Courtesans were often accused of manipulating their patrons, some fairly, others falsely. They had access to letters from foreign embassies, details of troop movements, knowledge of contracts, dowries, and betrayals. The Venetian Council of Ten kept files on many courtesans, especially those with ties to military men. A courtesan's bedroom was considered, quite literally, a potential security breach. In 1559, a courtesan known as La Rosa Nera was arrested and interrogated for passing letters to the French ambassador, her patron, a discredited condottiero, formerly employed by the Papal States. Her defense: "I never read them. I only carried them under my skirt." She was released after 6 weeks. He disappeared. Whether they loved each other is unknown, but the risk they shared was real. One of the most curious things about the intimacy between condottieri and courtesans is how it was layered with performance. He, the brave but haunted war captain Giaci, the clever temptress who saw through his armor. But sometimes the roles dissolved. The swordsman confessed his fears. The courtesan removed her mask. In a rare diary fragment from 1542, the aging condottiero Cesare di Ramunia writes, "I speak to her of dreams I once had. She listens not to seduce, but to understand. Her silence is not rehearsed. It is the most terrifying thing I have known." Such moments, fleeting and private, hint at a deeper form of intimacy than either may have planned. Not just bodily closeness, but a shared reckoning with time, regret, and mortality. When a condottiero died, in battle, in exile, or in bed, the courtesan left behind was neither wife nor mistress in the eyes of the law. She could not claim inheritance. She could not mourn publicly. She might not even be allowed at the funeral. But many did mourn. A poem from 1561, penned anonymously and found among a courtesan's belongings, reads, "He gave me no name, but his hand was a roof. Now the ink dries, and my breath folds into memory." These women became widows without status. Some retired, others returned to lower ranks of courtesanship. A few took on new patrons, always with the stain of whispered scandal, and some disappeared, leaving only perfume traces in guest ledgers and rumors in the halls of old villas. Not all condottieri found companionship in the salons of courtesans. Some formed deep, often long-term bonds with younger officers, bodyguards, or squires, artists, poets, or musicians in their orbit. These relationships were almost never publicly acknowledged. Italy's moral strictures, particularly after the Counter-Reformation, grew increasingly hostile to any form of same-sex intimacy. But traces remain. An anonymous Florentine chronicler writes, "The captain d'Este sleeps always beside the boy with the lute. They dine from the same plate. They wear twin rings." This could mean anything or everything, whether romantic, sexual, or emotional. These partnerships offered a different kind of refuge, away from politics, from performance, from the expectations of masculinity. In this, the condottiero once again stepped outside the law. not for coin, but for connection. By the late 1500s, the age of the great mercenary captain was over. Military science moved on. Standing armies replaced rented swords. But what of the men who had lived by war, and the women who had loved or outwitted them? Their stories became literary tropes. The tragic courtesan, the brooding warlord, the lover who died without name. But the real stories, the ones written in ink, in sweat, in whispered confession, faded. And perhaps that was by design. After all, what ruler wanted to preserve tales of unregulated love, formed in defiance of contract, custom, and church? So what was intimacy for the condottieri and their courtesan lovers? It was transactional, yes, but also full of real risk. It was public, but never truly seen. It was negotiated, yet never entirely controlled. And as we press our ear to the marble halls of history, we're left with a final question. In a world where everything was a performance, the battlefield, the bedroom, the salon, did the condottieri ever find a love that was not bought or sold, but simply given? And if they did, who remembers it now? By the close of the 16th century, the mercenary dream of the condottieri had become a melancholy echo. Their time was over. Gunpowder had replaced valor, formations replaced flair, and the cities they once protected or exploited turned their gaze toward diplomacy, trade, and centralized armies. But what of the men who had lived their lives by the sword, and the women who'd known them not in the light of battle, but by candlelight beneath silk sheets, in shadowed salons, and behind closed shutters? In this final section, we trace the twilight of these lovers, the erosion of their place in society, and the fading fingerprints they left on the marble of Italy's history. This is not a story of loss alone, but of what survives quietly in the margins. The last true condottieri men who operated entirely independent of any standing national army faded by the early 1600s. Their legacy was absorbed into court militias, professional officer corps trained in the Spanish or French model, and eventually ceremonial roles in small duchies and principalities. Some condottieri retired with wealth. Others lost everything in failed campaigns or poor political bets. A handful wrote memoirs, heavy with self-justification and romantic exaggeration. Few mention their intimate relationships at all. And the courtesans, their golden era too, was ending. The Counter-Reformation swept through Catholic Europe, bringing a moral crackdown that made the registered courtesan class both suspect and dispensable. Many were forced out of Venice or down into the shadows, their salons shuttered by state decree or religious fervor. Where once a courtesan could quote Virgil to a mercenary general in a ballroom, now she might be hiding, aging, or forgotten. Some former courtesans married, usually to merchants or minor nobility. Others took religious vows, becoming nuns or lay sisters in charitable orders. A few became madams, overseeing younger women and trying to shield them from the worst of the trade. They remembered their condottieri not as heroes, but as men who wept after killing, men who gave them books instead of jewels, men who forgot their names after the next campaign. One elderly Venetian woman, interviewed by a French traveler in the 1630s, said simply, "He gave me a dagger with gold on the hilt. He said I was his only piece. I kept the dagger. The piece never came." Whether real or embellished, her story is one of many fragmented truths scattered across time. half remembered by those never meant to be remembered at all. Some condottieri left behind illegitimate children, born of courtesans, servants, or lovers who never appeared in public. These children bore no crest, no title, no rights, but some bore names whispered only in private. Marcello, said to be the son of a Florentine captain and a Neapolitan courtesan. Livia, rumored daughter of a Roman mercenary and his Greek servant girl. Orphans who knew nothing of their lineage but wore a certain ring or kept a small sword wrapped in silk. They lived on, not in power, but in presence. Bakers, musicians, priests, tailors. Their only inheritance was the myth of a man their mother once called beloved, and a world that no longer believed her. Venice moved on. The salons emptied. The brothels closed or went underground. The war councils were replaced by bureaucrats and bankers. But the buildings remained, the rooms, where courtesans once listened to the confessions of men who killed for money. Some of these spaces are now apartments, offices, art galleries, yet, in certain light, one might still imagine a silk robe across a chaise, a dagger on a side table, a man too dangerous to love, sitting quietly as a woman reads him a sonnet. The ghosts do not linger in sorrow. They linger in unfinished conversations. What set these relationships apart was not their transactional origin, but their evolution. Some condottieri came to see their courtesan lovers not as playthings, but as equals, dangerous, witty, knowing. Some courtesans found in their mercenary companions a man who, for all his violence, understood loneliness. These were unofficial partnerships, not bound by the church, nor by family alliances, nor by social approval, and yet they shaped the decisions of men who moved armies, negotiated truces, and redrew maps. Could they truly have loved each other? Perhaps, or perhaps they simply recognized in each other the same truth. They were both professionals, selling something the world needed but refused to honor. In official records, the condottiero appears as a hired sword, commander of 400 pikes. The courtesan is listed as resident of San Polo, known for poetry and discretion. Their stories, together, are not documented, but they are suggested in purchases made under aliases, letters signed with initials, gifts never taxed, and sometimes, in a painting, a reclining woman with a book, a faint scar on her collarbone, a soldier in the background, unnamed, eyes turned toward the sea. So what was intimacy for the condottieri and their courtesans? It was a fleeting armistice, a place without contracts, a breath between trumpet blasts, not free of calculation, not without betrayal, but sometimes, in the silence of a late hour. It was something like real affection. And so we end this chapter with a final question. When history forgets the hands that held each other, when the scrolls list only wars and contracts, is it still possible that, for a few nights in Venice, a hired sword and a painted woman knew something more lasting than power? They came down from the Alps like an avalanche, Swiss mercenaries, known for their discipline, their terrifying pike formations, and their unshakable commitment to coin. From the late 15th century through the early 18th, Swiss soldiers were among the most feared and sought-after warriors in Europe. French kings, Italian dukes, German princes, all paid handsomely for Swiss muscle. But what of the men behind the pikes? They were farmers' sons, mountain men, sometimes only boys when they marched off. They served far from home, in countries whose languages they barely spoke. They were loyal not to causes, but to contracts, and between campaigns, or even during them, they sought warmth in unfamiliar beds. This story turns not on battlefields, but in barrack rooms, brothels, and borrowed homes, the quiet, intimate spaces where Swiss mercenaries negotiated not just money, but affection, desire, and the ache for something stable. Swiss mercenary tradition began in the 14th century, but exploded in the wake of their shocking military victories against Habsburg armies. Their square pike formations and stoic battlefield tactics became legendary by the 16th century. It was common to see entire Swiss regiments fighting under the French banner, wearing their own uniforms, following their own captains, but paid in French gold. Their discipline was prized. Their barracks were orderly. Their oaths were binding. But their private lives, like their marching routes, were winding, irregular, and often improvised. Most Swiss soldiers were unmarried, due to the risk of death and the instability of campaign life. Far from home for years at a time, forbidden to settle locally without permission, often regarded with suspicion by locals as both protectors and potential plunderers. In this strange, liminal space between belonging and passing through, they made intimate connections wherever they could. When Swiss regiments camped near French towns, they sparked complex interactions. Some soldiers were quartered in private homes, meaning they lived alongside families, ate with local women, slept under unfamiliar roofs. These enforced proximities led to everything from grudging tolerance to long-term liaisons. A laundress might fall in love with a captain. A widowed innkeeper might find company in a quiet Swiss sergeant. A French farmer's daughter might bear a child with a man who didn't speak her language. There were no rules, only negotiations. Some arrangements were romantic, others were purely practical: protection for housing, food for affection. Some involved coin. Swiss soldiers were often well paid, and that brought options. One town record from 1647 in Burgundy notes, "The corporal from the Swiss company resides still with Madame Elise, despite orders to relocate. Their bond appears... stable." That last word, stable, hints at the unusual, something lasting, or at least unchanging, in a world that never stood still, where official relationships were discouraged or impossible. Many Swiss soldiers turned to the regulated brothels of France. These institutions were legally permitted until suppressed under Louis XIV, taxed, supervised by municipal authorities. Swiss soldiers were often described in brothel records as polite, punctual, generous, but also aloof, cold, and unromantic. Perhaps it was cultural, or perhaps it was simply the shield of men trained to survive any emotional entanglement. A few never loved again. Some married, others bakers, gendarmes, stablemen. Others became mothers of ghost children, raised on stories of a father who once carried a pike and sang in a language no one else spoke. So what did love look like in the twilight hours of a Swiss regiment? It was not loud, not written in vows, but it was practiced in habit, defended in argument, sustained in letters never sent. And we are left with a quiet, persistent question. If a man's oath belongs to a king, but his evenings to a woman in a borrowed room, who, in the end, holds his heart? And if neither truly claims it, does it simply dissolve, like the snowmelt from his homeland, fading into foreign soil? For centuries, the Swiss mercenary was a foreign body within the French host, trained to fight, ordered to stay distant, expected to disappear. But in practice, these men built lives among the people they were paid to protect, and sometimes paid to suppress. This final section explores the endings, how relationships withered or endured when orders came, how soldiers returned home to mountains that no longer felt like home, and how the legacy of those soft, unrecorded intimacies lived on, if only in whispers, birth ledgers, or the worn stones of shared doorsteps. This is not a story of victory or loss. It is a story of quiet departures and the emotional weight left behind when a soldier's body moves on. But part of him never leaves. Swiss regiments in France were not permanent postings. Soldiers rotated every few years, sometimes by design, often by demand. A war in Flanders, a rebellion in Lang, a royal death. Orders came abruptly. A man might leave in the morning, after years in one town, without time for a goodbye, a final night, an explanation. Women left behind were given no status, no widow's pension, no official recognition of partnership, no access to the barracks or belongings. Some followed across provinces, sometimes even into battle zones, hoping to maintain the life they'd built. A few were allowed to stay, unofficially. Most were turned away by officers or by local communities who viewed their presence as unlawful baggage. In Metz, 1717, a young mother was caught trailing a Swiss regiment. The officer's report notes, she says the child is his, he denies it. We have neither time nor coin for her mercy. They were left behind. For those Swiss soldiers who survived long careers and returned home, back to the cantons and mountain villages. Life was not always welcoming. Some returned with wealth, others returned with scars no one could explain, stories no one wanted to hear, habits of silence, distrust, and wandering. Many had left as boys. When they came back, the towns had changed. Their families had died or moved. They brought with them no wife, only rumors of lovers in France, children left unnamed, debts unpaid. Some tried to write letters back, others sent coin when they could. But most did what soldiers do best. They compartmentalized, buried the memory, and moved on, or attempted to. One Swiss veteran of the French Guard settled as a baker near Zurich. His journals, preserved by accident, contain a single note. Her name began with M. I remember the smell of yeast in her sheets. No address, no surname, just memory without destination. For French communities, the memory of Swiss soldiers lingered. Differently, some were remembered fondly. He helped repair the church roof. He protected the girls during the riots. He brought chocolate for the children on feast days. Others were remembered darkly. He drank too much. He hit her once. He was gone before the child was baptized. In both cases, the soldier became a ghost, not present, but shaping behavior, shaping bloodlines, shaping how people told their own stories. A girl might be told, "You have your grandfather's nose," the Swiss one. A boy might be warned, "Don't end up like your father, always marching, never staying." And in this way, the soldier who left never fully left. A few Swiss-French unions were later legitimized, post facto marriages, often brokered when a soldier decided to retire locally. In rare cases, these men applied for naturalization, changing names, changing flags, shedding the white cross for the fleur-d-list. But for most, the divide remained permanent. The soldier belonged to the canton, the woman belonged to the town, their child belonged to no one but time. And yet, in the letters that were kept, the cradles that were carved, the songs that were sung to infants with German lullabies, something survived. Not official, not noble, but true. The tragedy and beauty of mercenary intimacy is that it happens without recognition. There are no monuments to Swiss-French unions, no museum's house, the beds they shared, the letters they wrote, or the bread they broke. But the signs are there. If you know how to look, a church record with a father's name left blank, a carving of a pike and a rose in an old farmhouse beam, a baby named after a man who only stayed 3 winters. And in those moments, we are reminded that history is not always written in wars, but in the rooms just beyond them, where soldiers, unsure of tomorrow, lay down their weapons and whispered something like love. So what was sex, and more importantly, affection, really like for Swiss mercenaries stationed in France? It was regulated, unofficial, and always at risk of vanishing. Yet it built something enduring, even if only in memory. These relationships were forged in practical need, yes, but they carried warmth, endurance, and in some cases, sacrifice. And so we close with one last question. If a man is paid to serve, but chooses to love, is that the only part of him that isn't for sale? And when he's gone, is it that love that lingers, or simply the silence where his name used to be? Between 1618 and 1648, Central Europe was consumed by the 30 Years' War, a conflict so devastating that entire regions were reduced to ash, famine, and silence. It began as a religious quarrel between Protestant and Catholic states within the Holy Roman Empire, but soon mutated into a sprawling continental bloodbath. By the end, it had claimed up to 8 million lives, many of them civilians. Soldiers marched across territories not for victory, but for survival. Armies burned towns, starved peasants, looted monasteries, and left behind disease, trauma, and children with no fathers. And yet amid the ruins, humans still touched, bargained, whispered, kissed, and clung to each other, sometimes for love, often for food, and always for survival. In this story, we explore what intimacy meant during the 30 Years' War, not as romance, not as pleasure, but as a negotiation with hunger, trauma, and death, where sex became a language of desperation, and tenderness a form of defiance. Unlike previous wars fought in campaigns and seasons, the 30 Years' War dragged on without clear lines. Mercenaries changed sides as often as the seasons. Towns were sacked, abandoned, resettled, and then sacked again. Soldiers slept in barns one night, castles the next, and corpses of homes the night after. Most armies, whether Protestant or Catholic, were not state-funded professional forces, but mercenary bands, often foreign, led by condottieri-like captains. They were fed not by supply lines, but by plunder. This meant the average soldier was almost always hungry, rarely paid on time, if at all, depended on the trosses, the mass of civilians, mostly women and children, who followed the army. And it was within this mass, this roiling, unregulated, and half-starving community that intimacy unfolded, not on beds of silk, but in mud and hay, under tattered blankets, in languages both shared and broken. The Trosses was a chaotic ecosystem. Wives and lovers of soldiers, laundresses, cooks, healers, sex workers, children, both born on the road and brought from home, merchants, criminals, fortune tellers, even actors. Many of these people were unofficial, but armies tolerated them because they were necessary. They fed the soldiers, washed their wounds, and in many cases, offered the only warmth a soldier would know. Sexual relationships within the Trosses were frequent, often shifting and unrecorded, sometimes based on affection, often transactional, bread for a night, safety for a week. Occasionally coercive power was uneven, and desperation blurred boundaries, but not all of it was exploitation. Amidst the horror, real companionship emerged, forged by the shared knowledge that death could arrive at any moment. It's tempting to imagine all women in the Trosses as prostitutes, but that's a myth. Many were married to soldiers, following them out of duty, or because they had no home to return to. Sisters or daughters of men in the ranks, widows who had joined the army caravan after losing everything. A woman might live in a tent with 3 soldiers, or alone beside a riverbank. She might cook, bandage wounds, or share her body for coin or for nothing, simply because touch made her feel alive again. One letter from a Swedish soldier in 1634, discovered in a military archive in Wurzburg, reads, "She sleeps by the fire. Her hands are cracked from boiling water. She smells of cabbage and smoke. I think I love her. We do not know her name. We do not know if she survived. But in that moment, in the cold, with death all around, she was his only country."